Welcome everyone to the next iteration of the IITE seminars. So it is my pleasure to introduce Eric Pedersen today from Concordia University in Canada. And he will tell us about something that I myself have often pondered in the past. How on earth do we actually define a patch in a metapopulation context? So without further ado, Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much for being here and for having me. I can't actually promise to give you a final answer about how to define a patch. I think we've made some headway, but I think one of the things I want to highlight from this talk is how surprised I was when I started digging into the early thoughts and thinking about, and like even modern thinking about metapopulations, is how fuzzy this definition of what a patch actually is. So given how fundamental metapopulations are for our theoretical thinking, we actually have very weak foundations about how we actually define what constitutes a patch. This work actually sprung out of some applied work I was doing for the Canadian government on modeling large-scale spatial temporal dynamics and trying to actually understand how do we cut large spatial populations into chunks that we can more efficiently manage them. So this was really directly derived from applied thinking, and that's driven a lot of theoretical work and tried to motivate the theory behind this. So just a bit of background. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page, when I'm talking about the metapopulation approach, or the idea of a metapopulation, this goes back to Hansky and before, so this goes back to Richard Levins. The basic idea is we are trying to, rather than trying to model movement and interaction, population dynamic interaction at the same time scales, we want to try to discretize things so we can separate scales. So the first step of this is we discretize landscapes into patches. So into habitat patches, so areas of patch. So this would be, these are different stocks of cod in Newfoundland. So these are hypothesized stocks of cod along the Newfoundland and Labrador shelf. And each circle represents basically a population patch, so a hypothesized well-mixed population. We assume that the dynamics are well mixed in the patch. That is, we assume that every individual has a roughly equal chance of interacting with any other individual. But one step we don't really define here is what we actually consider to be well mixed. And then we make the final assumption that inter-patch interactions occur through infrequent dispersal. So that is, on timescales, an individual is much more likely to interact with the other individuals in the patch than they are to disperse between patches. Because if dispersal happens at the same timescale as within patch interaction, there's not really a point to breaking things into patches. It really should be treated more continuously. So these are the fundamental breakdowns for how we define a patch. So using these three basic assumptions. And this goes, like I said, this goes back to Levins, but at no point have we really sat down, as far as I can tell, as a field to determine how do we actually define a patch. We typically, the typical theoretical derivation says, okay, we assume dynamics within patches are well mixed, but at no point do we define what we mean by well mixed. Like, how often do we have to have interactions happening locally versus across the range for it to be considered well mixed? And actually, so just to see the range of thinking on this, and thinking about like how you define a patch, I'm actually going to do an exercise. So I haven't tried this via Zoom, but I want to try this via the Zoom tool, where everyone you can raise your hands in Zoom. So if you click on the participant pad, I think if you click on reactions at the top, you should have a chance to be able to raise your hand. So what I want to ask, first of all, is if I've got a landscape like this, so this is a landscape for an organism where black areas represent high quality habitat, areas where the individual is likely to spend a lot of time and reproduce. Gray areas represent moderate quality habitat where they can feed, but maybe not reproduce. They'll move through it and feed there, but not reproduce. And white represents areas where they won't feed or reproduce. They'll only move through it if they have to. So given those criteria, so high quality, mid quality, and low quality habitat, how many people here would define this as two separate patches? So just raise your hand. I'll give you about 10 seconds. Okay, seeing a lot of hands raised here. That one, I think, is hopefully unsurprising. This is very clearly two separate patches. Okay, so I'm going to ask folks to put your hands down. I'm actually going to pin my video here so it's not jumping around. So folks can put their hands down. I'm going to ask a second question then. So how many people would consider this to be two separate patches? So hands up if it's 2 patches, not if it's, we consider it's 1 patch. Okay, so maybe close to half. We got maybe 50, 50, 50, and a decent number of non-responses. And the final one I want to look at, how many people would consider this to be 2 separate patches? So we've got the same roughly the same area, but they're very close to each other, but still separated by a visible gap. Okay, so I'm seeing, again, half. It's hard to say if this is the exact same number of same people, but yeah, this should hopefully give you a sense of, how variable the opinions on this can be. And so if I'll ask people to put hands down now, but I want to get you thinking about like how you mentally define what a patch is, because often when we think about patches, we define them as contiguous. But what I would actually argue is that in this case, this is actually a trick question. So both of these could be considered separate patches depending on how the organism that's living in them is moving. I didn't tell you anything about how the organism was moving. The key factor is different organisms, as they'll move forward, will treat these as separate or equal patches. So for instance, this top one, if you have, say, if you have a snake moving through this area that will move through areas like this, we'll move through areas like this, but it won't venture out into open countryside. So they won't venture out to open countryside. A snake might actually treat this as a single patch. So this might be a single patch for a snake. Oh, sorry, I'm getting this mixed up. Actually, so this would be a separate patch for a snake where we're seeing infrequent movement between it, but it might be a single patch for a bird. Whereas here, if we have, say, 2 separate areas with an area between them, this snake's not going to move between this open area. So it's not going to move through. So this actually might be 2 separate patches, but a bird living in these core habitats might flip back and forth between them. Whereas here, say the bird flitting back and forth between these might not actually move frequently between these 2 spots. So whether this are 2 patches or a single patch is going to depend heavily not on just the habitat quality and arrangement, but how organisms move through that habitat. Whether or not they regard things like long corridors like this to be something that they would only rarely pass between, or whether they consider the very low quality habitat to be entirely insurmountable obstacles. So again, it really depends on not only the quality of the habitat, but how we define and how organisms move through it. And this also raises the problem then of how do we define a patch in continuous landscapes? So even if we stuck with the concept of a patch as a contiguous patch of habitat, if we're dealing with continuous landscapes where habitat quality varies continuously, it's rare to actually see species treat habitat as either good, bad, or medium. If habitat quality varies continuously, we have a bigger problem of how do we separate landscapes like this into patches when there's not even contiguous chunks we can cut it into. So this represents a depth map for Newfoundland and Labrador, and this represents the biomass density of northern shrimp. So this is one of my study species. This is actually the species that originally motivated the study, because we were trying to figure out how do we cut this landscape up into patches. So it's pretty obvious looking at it that there's areas of high biomass. It's not continuous everywhere, and there's definite groupings. So we can say, okay, there's areas here in the north that can form potentially large-scale groupings, but at no point can we draw like lines and say these are contiguous, discrete areas. So we want to try to break this up, but we want to try and break it up in a way that's meaningful, that accounts for organism movement, rather than just like arbitrarily drawing lines through this. And I argue we should be doing this based on interaction. So we should be determining where we're drawing these lines based on how local interaction acts to synchronize individuals. So we know that within a given area, interaction occurs locally. So typically most individuals, so northern shrimp here, are going to be competing for food over relatively small spaces. So if we're trying to define a patch based on purely on interaction, we might actually define patches as minuscule. But we also know that individuals can move over long time, over distance scales in their lifespan. And they move over multiple distance scales. We can't just treat this as, say, this diffusive movement. So as we track marine movement, we see that organisms move in complex and dynamic timescales. So this is a mark recapture study of the movement of a single lobster across the coast of Nova Scotia. What we can see is the movement track it's following is following a relatively complex pattern of small scale movement alternating between occasional longer scale displacements. And this is very, very common for marine organisms to show this like relatively smaller scale, short-term movement in an area, but also coupled with infrequent longer scale displacements that could actually act to couple distinct populations. So while we generally define patches based on these contiguous areas of habitat, so trying to define patches based just on continuity, most actual landscapes, and this is just an example of an island landscape, so what we typically think of when we think of a metapopulation, we want to be able to apply this metapopulation to these more continuous landscapes and to find areas of landscape that can be broken into discrete patches in a meaningful way. So in a biologically meaningful way where it's not just an arbitrary choice about how we split these. And since we can rule out, continuity, we can rule out whether or not things are continuous or not. And even, rules of thumb like trying to average over continuity, averaging over areas or trying to cut at narrow points doesn't take into account the fact that individuals might be able to move through relatively small areas. So we might not be able to cut this region into patches if shrimp actually did move frequently from one area to another. So what we should be defining patches on, and I would say, I argue, is synchrony. So how, something should be considered to be a patch if there's enough local movement and interaction between individuals in a given area that it is sufficient to effectively fully synchronize the population dynamics in that patch. So if we're looking at different areas in this landscape, if we look at, say, some of the major regions of this landscape, so this is the Hopedale channel, we have the Cartwright channel, and the Hawk channel. If we look at the long-term population dynamics of this, even though these are spatially close, and even though based on what we were looking at previously, there might be dispersal of shrimp between these, what we actually see is that the population dynamics in these three regions are very distinct. So within each region, so these show estimated population dynamics for these. So the purple and orange represent estimates from two different methods. Basically, we have a break in the data series and the time series here. But what we can find is that we find distinctly asynchronous dynamics between these regions. So each of these channels effectively acts like a single well-mixed population. And even though they're relatively spatially close, we can distinguish them based on synchrony. Now, I think this, synchronization is actually a relatively strong criteria to argue for defining a patch, and that if you can't distinguish 2 points based on time series, they should be treated as being in the same patch. But actually trying to measure synchrony between all points in a landscape is an incredibly expensive process. So it would take us a massive amount of data and a massive amount of time and effort to try and measure population dynamics and fine detail across every point in this landscape and try to measure which areas are synchronous with which. And we also want to define patches based on synchrony driven by interaction. So just synchrony being driven by, say, large-scale oceanographic currents or things like temperature gradients won't necessarily tell us that, okay, if individuals die on one side of this patch, it'll affect individuals on the other. So what I argue we should be looking at instead is synchronization driven by movement. And to do that, we need to be able to estimate how likely individuals are from a movement model are to encounter each other in the same patch. So how frequently are individuals that start out in different points of an area likely to interact with each other over a long enough time horizon to be meaningful? So this led to us thinking about how do we actually define what a patch is based on movement. So if we start with a landscape like this, so this shows high quality in black, mid quality habitat in gray, and white quality habitat in white. We've got a relatively complex landscape, and we might want to segregate this landscape into patches. So this is an example landscape of what we might want to split into patches. And there's a few cases where we might wonder, okay, should we be splitting say, this into two distinct patches because it's narrow and thin? Or should we be splitting this into two patches because it's got this, it's got an area of moderate habitat quality between it? Or, would this larger area be considered a single patch because there's frequent enough movement between it? So we should be defining this based on, if we can actually measure movement, then we can use these movement patterns and estimated movement patterns to determine whether or not we should be grouping these into patches. So the basic first argument, I'd say, is that if an individual is in a patch, so we want to define something as a patch, then the individual should spend most of its time inside that area. So any area that we consider to be a patch, an individual should only rarely leave it. So if we can measure the movement, we can estimate the movement of the individual, it should be rare for an individual to leave a patch wherever we arbitrarily define, wherever we define that patch as. So this red individual here, for instance, spends most of its time in this area. It does displace between here to here, and then spends most of its time in this area. And this is actually simulations of movement for basically using a simplified selection algorithm where the individual is deciding which step to take based on the quality of the habitat it's currently in and the quality of the habitat available to it based on dispersal kernel. And then it assumes that it makes more straight line movements when it's in low quality habitat than when it's in high quality habitat. So given this assumed movement model, you can see this individual is spending a lot of time here or here and very little time here. So this first criteria is, okay, individuals should spend most of their time within patches. And second, we should define patches that a patch should be defined as if two individuals in the same patch have a high probability of encountering each other, that should be sufficient to define a patch. So if you have two individuals like the red and the blue individual here, you'll notice that they start, this individual starts out here, eventually makes its way over here, but it rarely crosses over this bridge. And the blue individual is spending most of its time in this area. So based on these movement patterns, so based on which patches these individuals are choosing, these individuals are unlikely to encounter each other in their lifespan or in a reasonable amount of time. Whereas say, taking the green and yellow with the same movement model in this area, these green and yellow individuals are encountering each other quite frequently. So starting from different locations, so green starting from here, yellow starting from here, they encounter each other quite frequently across their time scale. And we can define this, the frequency of encounter based on how frequently they encounter another individual that started from the same patch. So if two individuals started with the same patch, if they encounter each other, two individuals started from different patches, they encounter each other roughly as frequently as they would if they'd started from the same patch. That's a pretty reasonable definition of well mixed. They should be if they encounter each other quite frequently, they're basically indistinguishable based on starting location. So given these basic criteria that individuals should spend most of their time within patches, and we can define interaction based on frequency of occurrence, we can define what counts as a patch based on frequency of interaction. This actually gives us a reasonable rule to start segregating landscapes into patches, but this is still just the skeleton of an argument. So this is still basically making the assumption that this is still, would be very difficult to define for a general pattern of movement. So if we had any possible movement model, this would be difficult to do. We wanted to try and figure out, okay, are individuals likely to encounter each other over a given time horizon? We'd actually have to simulate a complex movement model for many time steps into the future. However, we do have at least some movement models where this is relatively straightforward. This is more straightforward to calculate or more computationally feasible than trying to simulate movement across all patches. One of the ones we've been focusing on is what's called the continuous time Markov chain model. This is a movement model that models movement between individuals as if they're taking steps between microsites, so very tiny points in the landscape, and they're choosing which sites they're moving to based on preference functions. So basically they compare between two different locations based on distance, based on habitat quality, and so on, and decide based on, take steps based on the relative probability of the preferences between them. So we can actually use this to estimate preference for a given individual across space. So using what are called step selection functions. And we can use these estimated step selection functions to infer movement rules that are easier to generalize. So the basic idea for the continuous time movement Markov chain movement model, so the CTMC, is we're assuming that individuals are moving across landscapes of discrete sites. So these are sites are defined as areas that are much smaller than any possible feasible patch. And the scale of discretization is really being chosen here based on computational feasibility rather than sort of any specific biological argument. But we're assuming that individuals start out in a site and then jump to another site at exponentially distributed time. And we can define the probability, so Pij here. We can define a probability of given t and tau. So this is the probability of finding an individual that started in grid cell I, so an individual that started in grid cell I, ending up in grid cell J after time t plus 1. So assuming it started here time t, and after tau amount of time, what we can define the probability of it showing up there as this Pij. So this is the generic. This is a generic function. We can define this for almost any movement model where we can define movement. The advantage of the Markov movement model is that we don't actually have to take into account the starting time. So because we're assuming movement patterns are Markovian, that individuals don't have memory as they move through this landscape, we assume that the probability of an individual I ending up at location J after fixed amount of time tau doesn't depend on t. So it doesn't depend on the time that's passed, it only depends on the starting location. We're basically assuming that an individual's movement patterns can be determined by the landscape it's moving through, but is not determined based on its past movement history. So given this, we can define for a given time scale, so given time for like how long we're willing to simulate movement into the future, we can define this matrix P, so capital P of tau, defines a transition matrix. So the probability of going between any site I to any site J in that time horizon tau. So giving you starting out in I, what's the probability of ending up in J for all possible sites on a landscape. So the continuous time Markov chain movement model, part of the assumption here is that we can actually define a derivative of this probability. So we can define a continuous time derivative of this probability as a function of tau. And we can find that this is actually a linear system. So it's a linear system of our probabilities, our starting probabilities, like where we're actually starting out across the landscape at time at tau 0, times a movement matrix. And this movement matrix has some useful properties. So the vertical column sum to 0. And the diagonal of this matrix actually tells us the residence time in a given patch. So how long it'll spend in a given patch before jumping out to an alternative patch. The entries of this M matrix actually represent the rates of movement between different locations on this landscape over a continuous time scale. And these can depend on the habitat characteristics and distances between these different patches. So what we can do with this, if we can make these assumptions, I'm just going to quickly go ahead through the assumptions again. So we're assuming that movement is Markovian, so there's no memory, and we're assuming that there's no time dependence of movement. So we're assuming that movement is constant over time, but depends on habitat scales, so that we can summarize the movement into this linear system of a movement matrix M times the starting configuration.
Sorry.
So given this,
for asking, is this so the right hand side is time independent, so the time derivative is equal to a constant?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're assuming that there's no variation in time or in movement behavior over time. So an individual that starts out here at time 1 has basically the same movement behavior as if it started out here at time 2 or 3 or 1,000.
Thanks.
And was there another question?
On the right-hand side, it should be P of 0 or P of tau?
P of 0. So this is our initial condition. So P of 0 being the distribution of individuals on the landscape at a given time.
Okay.
So if we're trying to actually determine, if we're trying to determine the probability of individuals starting at I going to a given location J, we'd actually start with P of 0 equaling 1 for I and then 0 for everything else. But we could also use this to simulate like a distribution across the landscape. So if individuals started across, distributed across a bunch of patches, where that distribution of individuals end up over time. So what we've been developing in the lab then is using these continuous time Markov chain models. So using this, we can actually generate a distance matrix between locations. So based on this movement model, we can actually use it to generate a distance matrix that measures effectively interaction probability. And this is work that I've been developing with an undergraduate student in my lab, so Spencer Sherman. So he studied math and biology here at Concordia, and he's been very helpful in working on the derivations, as well as doing a lot of computational tests on this end. But we've been trying to basically take this idea of continuous time movement Markov chains and use them to derive distance matrices that we can use to cluster landscapes. And the basic way this works, so we're starting with a vector of probability. So if we define xi, so xi, this is a vector of probabilities of finding an individual that started at location I at time 0 at different locations of the landscape. So this I indexes that we're saying we're talking about an individual that starts out here. What's the probabilities that it ends in a bunch of different locations on the landscape J? And given this, so given the assumption of this continuous time Markov chains, we can actually solve this with a linear system. So this probability at time tau is just equal to, so xi at time 0 is going to be just 1 when at I, 0 and everything else. And then this is going to be the transition probabilities for that particular location. And then we can actually solve this. So because of the linearity of the system, because of the assumptions of the continuous time Markov chain, we can actually replace this matrix with the matrix exponential of the movement matrix, so M, times our time scale tau. So we don't actually need to know, if we can solve this exponential, we actually don't need to know this, this individual point. And this will be true for across multiple timescales. So we can start with the movement matrix and then solve it for any given length of time, any given time scale we want to solve this for. And because because this is a linear system, we can also use an eigendecomposition to solve this matrix as well. So we can use the fact that we can decompose this exponential into its eigendecomposition, where I always get my Greek names mixed up, where psi is our right eigenvectors, left eigenvectors. Lambda is our a diagonal matrix of eigenvalues of the movement matrix M, and then phi is the right eigenvectors of the movement matrix M. So we could replace this matrix exponential with this matrix exponential. So just using the eigenvalues from the movement matrix, we can then approximate, we can then calculate the same calculation if we have all the eigenvectors. And these eigenvectors actually allow us to simplify this calculation process. So it's much more computationally efficient to calculate distances between interaction probabilities between locations. Importantly, the leading right eigenvector, so our phi1, which we define as pi, so we just call pi is the long-term occupancy probability, gives the probability of finding an individual in any point in the landscape over an infinite time horizon. So this is a long-term distribution of where the individual would be at a given location, and lets us separate the landscape into areas of high and low occupancy. So basically, if this pi value is high, we could say the landscape should be counted as part of a patch. If pi is low, below 1 over the number of sites in the landscape, we can define it as being matrix. So it's very unlikely to find an individual in that specific cell over an infinitely long time horizon. So this tells us, okay, over a really long time horizon, what's the probability of finding an individual at a given location? We also want to know, okay, over shorter time horizons, what's the probability of individuals being at a given location? So we want to use that to define interaction probabilities, how often they are likely to interact with each other. So the nice thing though is we can actually use the other, if we want to define interaction probabilities, we want to look at the chance of two individuals interacting versus the chance that they'll interact with another individual that start at the same site, to actually use what's called kinetic distance. So this is, So if these are our probabilities of being in, sorry, I realize this should actually be, this should be x, xi, and xt, but this is the probabilities of being in of being in a given patch at a given tau, given you started in I or started in J. We look at the difference between these and take this inner product. This actually gives us basically the difference between the probability of two individuals interacting, being in this from that started in the same location interacting. So you think about pi times pi. So these two vectors, the inner product of these two vectors with itself. That gives us the probability of two individuals that started in the same patch encountering each other at time tau. We can do the same thing for J, and the difference between them tells the difference of what's the probability of them interacting with each other. So pi, inner product of pi times pj, it's going to give us the probability of two individuals that started in different patches interacting with each other. So the difference between this will be large if individuals are much more likely to interact with other individuals that started from the same location as individuals that start out in different locations. And this distance will be small if individuals are just as likely to encounter from two different sites, are just as likely to encounter each other as they are to encounter individuals that start out from the same site as them. So this map here shows the kinetic distance from a specific point. So anything in these yellow colors represents points that are low kinetic distance away from this location. And anything that is in darker purple shows points that are further kinetic distance away from this location. And this is based on a derivation by Noe and Clemente on actually defining these interaction probabilities based on Markovian systems of chemical equations, or Markovian chemical systems. But it holds for this too. This actually gives us a measure of interaction probabilities for individuals across space. So we can write this same equation, as a summation of differences. So this is if we sum for a given number of sites. So if we look at all the sites where individuals might encounter each other, k, this gives the probability of individuals started in location I, ending up in location k after time tau. Same for j. We sum this encounter probability across all individuals. We can actually approximate this summation, which is a very big summation. So it requires something like, if we have, say, n sites, this summation requires n cubed calculations. So a massive number of calculations for even a relatively small number of sites. We actually approximate this, though, by using the leading eigenvectors of this system. So rather than using all of the eigenvectors, most of the eigenvectors actually, after any any reasonable length of time tau, effectively drop out. They stop contributing to the final solution. So we can basically drop most of the eigenvectors except for the d leading ones and still approximate the solution. So we replace a calculation that requires n by n calculations with a calculation that requires n by d calculations. So substantially fewer total calculations, assuming the number of eigenvectors selected is smaller than the number of sites. And just numerically, we found that, on a landscape of, say, 1,000 locations, we can get away with 30 or 40 eigenvectors and still approximate the final solution very effectively. So we can massively reduce the computational time by only focusing on the leading eigenvectors. But once we calculate this kinetic distance, based on a reduced set of eigenvectors, we can use this kinetic distance then, just like any other distance matrix, to cluster locations hierarchically. So we can derive our patches of the landscape based on these probabilities of interaction, with now locations being clustered together only if they're similarly likely to encounter each other relative to the probability of individuals encountering another individual that started from the same site. So this gives us an objective way of actually clustering these landscapes into patches based on probability of encounter. So based on a definable feature of the movement properties of these landscapes, which would in turn correlate with synchronizability. So the more frequently individuals are likely to encounter each other, the more able they are to synchronize dynamics within a patch. So just as a simple, it's just an example to demonstrate that this works for a real landscape. So the previous one was focusing on this relatively simple landscape. or toy landscape. We've actually applied this as well to the northern shrimp example just to see if it could work for our case. So we use some simple movement rules. We assume that because we have to rely on simple movement rules here because we don't actually have things like radio-collared shrimp. It turns out it's very difficult to radio-collar shrimp to track its movement, but we can know some basic principles about how they'll move. So we know that shrimp tend to move towards preferred habitat over less preferred habitat. We expect them to move in relatively fast straight line movements in relatively low quality habitat. They shouldn't spend much time there. And we know shrimp are limited in how far they can move. So given these three movement rules, we can estimate a movement model, or we can approximate a movement model for these species. So given that, we can actually calculate our kinetic distance from this. So the basic process is we take this movement model, we calculate our kinetic distance based on, I believe we're using something like 30 eigenvectors from this. And we can calculate the distance between locations and cluster this landscape into patches based on it. So now we're actually able to define, using this kinetic distance, areas that should be considered to be considered patches for, say, management purposes. So you're able to say cut this coastline down into areas of habitat that we can treat as homogeneous or well mixed in terms for managing this landscape or for modeling this landscape. And this, so this process, so this is something like 20,000 sites, 30,000 sites. So this, actually solving this, solving the 30,000 by 30,000 matrix would be an incredibly long time on its own. Whereas using the eigenvalue-based approach, we're able to calculate the kinetic distances here in about 15 minutes or so, 10 or 15 minutes. Whereas solving the full matrix, using all of the, or actually, solving the matrix exponential without taking into account these eigenvector approximation would likely take, a solid month to calculate. So we are able to get substantial speedups in here, and we're able to find an effective way of actually breaking this landscape into patches based on movement criteria from these animals. So just in summary, so overall, I'm arguing we should be defining patches based on encounter rates, and fundamentally, we should be defining patches based on synchronization. So patches to be areas of synchronized population dynamics, where synchrony is being driven by local interaction, not just continuity of habitat. And we should be using, and we can show that we can develop an algorithm, the eigenpatch algorithm, that can use a specific movement model from the class of continuous time Markov chains to break landscapes up into habitats versus matrix, and to cluster habitat regions into patches based on encounter probabilities. So we're continuing to develop this. So where are we going next with this? So first of all, we're working now to try to remove the dependency on interactions at a single time. So right now, this method I'm discussing defines things being clustered together based on interaction at time tau, but we actually want to average across multiple time scales. So we don't want to just look at time tau. We actually want to look at, okay, what's the probability of interacting across a demographically relevant period of time for an individual? So if a single shrimp lives for 5 years, we want to see, okay, what's the average number of interactions between two individuals across 5 years? And we think we have a solution for this that still is relatively fast to calculate, but I didn't, we're still debugging it, so I didn't want to show the results here. But we do think we actually have a way of replacing this single time interaction parameter with a more relevant timescale interaction parameter. We're also working on refining the default settings for the clustering algorithm. So like any clustering process, the clusters we find are sensitive not only to the distances we get, but also hyperparameters for the clustering algorithm itself. The minimum distance you can use, how large, what we're actually defining a cluster as. So we're still refining these clustering algorithms being used, and we're also testing this approach in the field. So this is a field team that's just out this summer. This is Allegra Spencieri. So she's a master's student in my lab, and she's been working on collecting step selection data from butterflies that have been an invasive species of butterflies, so the European common blue, shown here, and using step selection and marker capture to try and estimate movement probabilities across landscapes. So we can use this to try and cluster the butterfly habitats in Montreal into patches to determine what actually qualifies as a minimum patch for the species. We're actually trying to validate this method on actual movement data rather than partially made up shrimp movement data. So I want to thank the lab, of course, as well as a bunch of people have given useful feedback on this. So Justin Marlowe, Melissa Guzman, Patrick Thompson, and Fritjof Lucher, who've all given feedback on different aspects of this as the project has progressed. And you can follow our team's work at Twitter, as long as Twitter survives as a functioning platform, which we're not going to make a bet on how long that will last. But you can also find our work at the PetersenFisheryLab.com. All right, thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was a fantastic talk. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand in the participant list, and I shall call on you. Yes, Axel, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Eric. And I was surprised the talk went in a different direction from what I thought. And my camera doesn't work, sorry. No, there is a standard technique for reducing high-dimensional problems to low-dimensional problems. And I don't know, it's essentially it's called center manifold reduction or something like this, or reducing to the slow manifold and just throwing away the fast manifold. And it boils down in your case to taking the dominant eigenvectors and eigenvalues and then modeling the system based on that.
Yeah.
And you know about this, but then in the end you didn't do this, right? You simply said I calculate something and I can speed up my calculation by using only the dominant eigenvalues. But actually, the result I would get is the same as if I would use the entire spectrum, and the clustering is a different thing. And you have parameter that, for example, I don't know, somehow controls the number of clusters, and that's different from the parameter that controls the cutoff in the dimensional reduction when you do the spectrum.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
why don't you do the central manifold thing? This is my kind. Why did you just say, okay, could we do the standard method and it gives us the center manifold or this fast manifold?
Yeah. So the motivation, so at least for the when we're saying that the eigenvector method approximates the final solution, what we mean is basically the solution is time dependent. So like this is like a slow manifold kind of problem, and I honestly think about this more as like basis functions, just because I'm a statistician, at least in part. I do a lot of work with basis functions, so I tend to think about this as, okay, we're using a set of basis functions to approximate a more complex solution, and these basis functions, which are the eigenvectors and eigenvalues, effectively capture most of the low dimensional variation in these interaction probabilities. So the probabilities of interaction at a given time tau can be approximated effectively by replacing the full solution with what you're saying. If I understand correctly, basically the center manifold solution. Like we're using this
fast manifold. Yes, I think it's center manifold.
We're basically throwing away the fast dynamics because we're assuming things shrink down to the slow manifold anyway.
Sorry, the slow, yes, and the slow. You reduce it to the slow dynamics because that's all you need. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's that. Noah and Clemente go into more depth in this, and we're going to go in more depth in the paper in this. But yeah, basically it is using the assumption, it is using the fact that like as tau increases, the real magnitude of most of the eigenvalues goes to zero, so effectively has no contribution to the final solution. So the longer tau is, the fewer eigenvalues you actually need to approximate the dynamics.
Yes. Okay, but did you try to use directly the eigenvectors corresponding to the smallest eigenvalues to calculate your patches? The eigenvectors will have a patchy structure on their own, and you could use that to calculate.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. So because the eigenvalues we're dealing with are actually for the matrix of interaction, so it's like it gives the matrix, it's a matrix of the pairwise interactions of the two patches. It's not necessarily giving the exact distribution of individuals, and like what I think about, where you're basically using the eigenvalue vectors themselves, like adding up the eigenvectors to give like clusters of areas, like breaking areas into clusters based on that, right?
Based on the eigenvectors, yes.
Yeah. So the issue we run into though is that actually because the continuous time Markov chain model doesn't depend on, it's not symmetric necessarily. Like you can actually have movement towards a patch be less than movement back. And we don't even have to have, we don't have to satisfy the assumption of detailed balance for this to work. So as a result, we can end up having, generically, like basically every model we try is generically ended up with complex eigenvectors and eigenvalues. So just using the eigenvectors would work if we had a symmetrical matrix, or even one that would satisfy detailed balance, where we could replace where we didn't need to know the right eigenvectors, we just need to know the left ones. We could use those to basically build a map of where individuals, should interact. But because we have to give this complex eigenvector issue, we have to use both the left and right eigenvectors, and it requires a bit more complex solution.
Can I interject here?
Yeah.
Aren't these matrices positive or non-negative?
They're positive, but they still have complex. So
but the leading one, shouldn't that be?
Yeah, the leading one is always positive and always, so the leading one is always positive and always is an eigenvector of, the M matrix is an eigenvalue of 0 for the leading one. And then once you exponentiate it, it's got an eigenvalue of 1. That's why we can treat it as the long-term solution. It's like if individuals are distributed according to that long-term solution, they'll stay at that long-term solution.
But sorry, I was asking this to clarify that does this issue with complex eigenvectors exist if only the leading one is important?
Well, but so you don't get many patches if you have only the leading one. In order to go 5 patches, you need eigenvectors.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and we'd actually experimented with one point about using like the sign of the eigenvectors to calculate patches. Like there's related work on what's called diffusion distance in statistics, which is using similar concepts, but that uses basically the sign of different eigenvalues to cluster things into patches. But that again relies on this assumption of effectively symmetry of the dispersal matrix.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Other people have questions too.
Thanks so much. Other questions? Klaus, please go ahead.
Hi. I don't know whether you can see me. Okay. Thanks, Eric, for a thought-provoking talk. I have actually 2 questions. So first, sort of by assuming a Markov chain process in a way, so you assume that individuals are very stupid, so they don't memorize, oh, I come from this very nice environment and maybe I should go back there, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess a lot of movement in many organisms is movement to explore the environment, sort of to know where it is good. But sort of, I guess, one has to start somewhere, and your approach doesn't cover this type of sort of organisms in a way.
No, it doesn't include movement. It also doesn't even allow for like autocorrelated, turning angles or things like that. So in this case, we're basically assuming that the site scale is large enough that autocorrelation basically washes out, that like any autocorrelation in turn angles is occurring at a time scale smaller than what we're worried about. But yeah, we don't currently incorporate memory. I would say that like this does make sense actually for a lot of the species we're studying, like something like a northern shrimp moving, it's a tiny animal moving over potentially tens or hundreds of kilometers. Its memory capacity is for where it went to, or its capacity to get back to where it was previously is close, probably close to 0. Or like the butterflies that Allegra is working with, as far as we can tell, they don't even show, like as they move from location to location landscape, they don't even show correlated turn angles. They're just like locally exploring the landscape. We're thinking about how to expand this to more complex ones. And honestly, I think like if you have an actually complex movement model, you could start with individuals distributed across the landscape and simulate any complex movement model, including ones of memory, and use it to simulate encounter probabilities between individuals. It would just require a massive amount of computational resources. So like a complex movement model is possible in this framework. You can still calculate these distances because the distances are based just on average probabilities of encounter. It just takes a lot of computational work to do it.
Right. And my second question is, so you often refer to individuals encountering with each other or interacting with each other, but I don't think you properly defined what you mean by interacting with each other. Sort of in game theory, you have pairwise interactions like fighting also, but I guess, I mean, the problems that I think about often interaction is through a shared resource. It's not direct interactions. And then I guess it becomes a question of the movement of the resource rather than, or additional than just the movement of the consumer species.
Yeah, and that's it's something I've thought about as well on how, like, here I'm defining interaction relatively generically. So assuming that, like, if two individuals are present in the same site, they can affect each other's dynamics in some way. That could be like they compete for, they reduce a resource that they might both be competing for, or they directly encounter each other. At least in this case, we're trying to abstract away from the specific details of small scale interaction, just because the problem gets, exponentially more complex if we start to add in fine scale detailed interaction mechanisms. In terms of your question about like movement of resources, I think this is definitely a mechanism that's responsible for synchronization for many organisms. So, for instance, my old PhD advisor, Fred Guichard, works on muscle dynamics, and one of the things that synchronized patches there is like local competition for mobile resources. The muscles aren't moving that frequently, but they are eating food in the same area that will synchronize each other, and they're also like attracting predators to each other. I think it does, down the line, I want to dig into this idea about how do we actually define patches for meta communities, because if it's tricky to define a patch for a single population, it's honestly even much harder to define it for a community. And I think we haven't really dug into that. And I think one way we could do that is to think about, okay, what is the synchronizing feature? So if you think about a community, like what is the fastest scale? Like what is the largest scale where we define synchrony of the community? Is there some resource flow or single predator that's acting to synchronize this whole community in the patch? So I think when we're dealing with non-mobile species, we do have to think about other synchronizing factors. But yeah, we haven't had a chance to tackle how that would work in this case.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks so much. Other questions? Yes, Jonas, please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just a tiny detailed question. So when you were talking about the shrimp and how you modeled their movement matrix, I think you said something about how they move in straight lines where in low resource areas.
Yeah.
But how do you do that when you don't have memory?
Yeah, so this case, we're largely making the assumption that the shrimp are moving relatively in constant paths or moving in relatively straight lines, and not moving purely straight lines here. They do potentially follow twisted paths. It's just the fraction of time that they turn, or like basically we're assuming that a single displacement can move over a longer distance in poor quality habitat than short quality. They potentially, I mean, there's still a lot we don't know about the sensory qualities of these, but we do definitely find like population structure in these ones, and we're finding more and more fine-scale genetic structure. And we do see like seasonal migrations of these species, so that they can, for instance, move between like warm and cool water across seasons, or they shift where they're mating to. So they do seem to at least have enough motive ability and control over their location to be able to determine, okay, we need to move to these locations to mate, or we need to move to these locations to avoid like different water conditions. But yeah, there's a ton we don't know about movement in these species, and it's something that I have collaborators who are really interested in trying to actually measure their movement capacity. But it's something we mostly just had to assume that they could do relatively straight line displacements when setting up this movement model.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Yeah, Theo, go ahead, please.
Hi there, thanks for the nice talk. I'd be curious to hear a little bit about like the philosophy of why we're doing this. Maybe I missed this at the beginning, but like if you have a prediction for the stationary distribution of all of the fish, then like what is the sort of benefit of defining patches? I guess it makes you makes it easier to like write down simple models. But I was wondering if you have some sort of quantitative or maybe intuitive understanding of what the benefit is eventually.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the stationary distribution, this is really the stationary distribution assuming movement alone is occurring. Like this is stationary distribution in the absence of population dynamics. So really what we want to do is be able to say, okay, given a movement model, like so the stationary distribution gives us a reasonable idea of like individuals moving on their own, where would they end up on a landscape? But it doesn't tell us, okay, how synchronous will those different locations of the landscape be? If something like wipes out a small population up north, so here, how does that propagate further south? Like, does that affect population dynamics further south? Or are they relatively isolated? And we can't tell that from the long-term distribution, because the long-term distribution is ignoring population dynamics. We're just assuming there's like a fixed number of individuals that are moving. So the finer scale, like the kinetic distance, allows us to take into account shorter time scales, but how quickly would individuals be able to move from, say, this location to here to repopulate it if there was something that caused a collapse? Or how frequently we'd expect, say, individuals from here to end up in this location competing for similar resources. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I don't still understand why you can't just combine that spatial information with an ecological model. Like what? Yeah, but
yeah, and
as opposed to a patch model. Yeah.
I think it really does. It really does come down to computational complexity, and that simulating a full continuous spatial model and a population model becomes computationally expensive. And it becomes increasingly reliant on small scale assumptions about like how accurate your assumptions of the movement process are. Whereas if we can break things, and I think why we as ecologists and applied ecological applications have so frequently gone to metapopulation models as the workhorse, is that it allows us to think about movement and population dynamics on different time scales. So we can model things like functional responses, like things like local interaction rates at one time scale, and then worry about movement and dispersal at a separate time scale. So we don't have to model both processes simultaneously in one model that gets computationally complex and it can get hard to interpret. Like there's honestly like a pretty strong drive to break things into patches for communication. It's much easier to tell someone that if we're dealing with, say, patches of shrimp habitat, it's much easier to tell someone like, hey, patch 1 here has collapsed. Then it's to say, okay, like the amount of the density here has gone down, but the density here has gone up, and the density here has stayed roughly the same. Like communicating change in discrete areas and thinking about and managing change in discrete areas is much more straightforward than trying to manage these things on a continuous scale. So as a theorist who works with applied people a lot, or maybe as an applied person who works with theorists, I often am faced with this challenge of how do we actually communicate this model, and how to communicate these modeling results in a way that will be usable by decision makers, rather than is the optimal way of modeling the specific population. And often that comes down to it often comes down to breaking things into meaningful areas, and then hopefully giving advice about, okay, how do we actually, what areas should we be managing as individual populations? Like if you're going to manage them as populations, how should you be drawing those lines?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Well, people are thinking maybe I will ask questions. Sorry, on the small scale, going back to the continuous differential equation again, what was a bit confusing to me, that's the solution, but that is a solution. Can we go back to the actual equation?
Yeah.
So that would be the solution if on the right-hand side we have P of tau, right? Or not quite, because this is an equation for P and not for X. I guess that's it.
So X, I was using Xi to represent basically P0 if everything was concentrated on a single point. So here P is a generic, this can be any distribution of individuals across locations, or any initial distribution. And this will tell us how that distribution evolves over time.
Okay, maybe I'll ask differently. Since the right-hand side is independent of time, why is the solution not P of tau equals M times P of 0 times tau plus initial condition?
Well, so the final solution is actually going to be this E of, it's actually an E of MT.
So that's what
tau times P.
So I understand that that's what we would get if in that equation on the right-hand side, it wouldn't be a P0, but a P tau.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm confused.
Okay.
There's probably some intermediate step.
Oh, you're asking why this derivation is?
So what is the, okay, I'll just ask without, what is the solution to this equation?
Yeah. Let's, let me, I'm very bad at drawing on this. I'm actually going to insert a new page here. So if, basically if we have, make sure that's right. So dp so that's going to be the solution to the equation.
But is it?
I think, sorry, I think the P of 0, the first equation should be P of
exactly.
tau.
That's a P of tau.
Yes. But
On the right-hand side.
Oh yes, you're right.
Okay, then everything makes sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
Then everything makes sense.
Yeah. My apologies. That's a good catch. I will. Thank you for the. Sorry, I see what you mean.
No worries. Okay, thanks. Yeah. Okay. Good. Then everything's good. I had another more sort of big picture thing. Does it make any sense in your case to try other so-called community detection algorithms to try?
Yeah, we're looking at comparing it with at least a few other ones. There's some popular ones. CircuitScape is one that's used. It's kind of the final. That's probably the last steps before we publish the paper is going to be the final comparison of this with it. Mm-hmm. We also want to compare like the actual clustering solution with. We want to determine actually does it correspond to how synchronous these dynamics are in different locations. So we actually simulate populations on these. Does the patches we find correspond to synchronized dynamics? Because I think that's really going to be the one to evaluate whether or not which clustering algorithms are working well is determining, okay, does the clustering algorithm actually break things into synchronous regions?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So that's basically our last steps for this one. We're still working on it, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
You're welcome. Yeah, I realize this work is still in progress. I think this is actually, I really wanted to get theorists' input onto this at an early stage before we were sending this out to final review.
Okay, can I get, in that case, I have one more question.
Yeah, of course.
What is the benefit you get out of a continuous time framework for doing this? And in particular, let me tell you why I'm thinking this, because if you had a discrete time model, then instead of e to the m times tau, you would have m to the tau, which, because you have, I assume, a very sparse matrix, because you can mostly move between neighboring patches, you could use some unknown iteration or some other method to very quickly compute high powers.
This, like the same, we actually have the code worked out for the discrete time case. So the discrete time case is just replacing that, like, if we go to here, it's just replacing e to the mt with
m to the tau.
M to the tau. And you end up with the exact same argument for the kinetic distance.
Mm-hmm.
We were focusing on the continuous time movement case because that's really what, like, step selection is becoming one of the most popular approaches now for developing movement models. And a step selection model is much easier to translate into continuous time than it is to discrete time.
Okay.
Because you don't have to choose a time scale And it also probably better, like you end up with more continuous time Markov models are actually better behaved than discrete time ones. So for instance, you don't have the possibility of cyclic behavior where you have like them going to B, A to B to C to B to, like, you can have cyclic-like behavior, but you'll never have a solution that's purely cyclic. Like that's, you know, where 100% of the individuals are ending up at one patch. So yeah, the continuous time is actually better behaved overall, and it's easier to translate a step selection model to continuous time than it is to discrete.
Okay. Okay, then the last thing is, do you think there's any chance that if you just need to raise a matrix to high power, then something like an Arnold iteration, because of it's a very sparse matrix, would give you comparable results? So have you tried anything like that? I'm just thinking
we haven't compared this we haven't compared the eigenvalue approach with other like sparse matrices, like the eigenvalue one, mostly because we've found calculating eigenvalues for even like calculating only a few eigenvalues for even relatively large matrices is pretty fast. So we haven't run into a bottleneck where we thought that, you know, moving to a sparse approach instead of like a low dimensional approach would make sense. But I think it is something that's I might actually leave this for someone who's better at numerics than I am to follow up down the line on, to determine if this, like, are there different approaches beside the eigenvalue one that would work faster for different circumstances. But I'm not enough of a numerical person to dip my hand too far into the, you know, which
I'm
method.
most certainly no numerics wizard, but since this is something that did come up some years ago in the past, I'm happy to help and just check out whether if there's a matrix like this, then
yeah, I'd be happy to chat about this down the line.
Helps, and it might turn out that it doesn't.
Yeah, because I think in the discrete time case especially, like the continuous time case is actually not sparse for any tau greater than 0. So it's part of the continuous time. Yeah. But the discrete case probably would be amenable to other sparse solving, like a sparse solution. Yeah, I'd be happy to chat about down the line.
Yeah. Happy to. But anyway, any last questions? If not, then thank you so much again, Eric, and thanks everybody for coming and hanging out. We will be continuing in 2 weeks. So until then, we hope to see you next time. Bye, everyone.